Welcome back to News 5. My name is Tanler and I'm your anchor for tonight. This is what we'll be covering for this week's hot topic. Now, in 2018, following the Me Too movement, thousands of Google employees were seen walking out of their offices in protest of the company's handling of multiple sexual harassment claims. These demonstrations began in Tokyo and took place at the same time in other places around the world, where the greatest numbers were observed in Zurich. Protesters were seen holding up signs like "Women's rights are human rights" and echoing that Google's time is up. However, the question still stands. Why and how has a series of events led this demonstration to be one of Google's worst crises yet? We've got the scoop on today's hot topic. In 2014, Google employee and the father of Android, Andy Rubin, left the company in light of several allegations of an inappropriate relationship with a subordinate. The executive was accused of running a sex ring where victims performed various sexual acts on camera with multiple men, including Rubin himself. Following these allegations, Rubin was said to have taken a leave of absence for personal reasons. This was until the 25th of October, where the New York Times published an investigation stating that Rubin was paid handsomely despite the multiple credible allegations of coerced sexual assault. Now, this exit package was not publicly known in 2014, but the investigation found that he received a whopping $90 million. This evidently angered a large number of Google employees, where the staff allegedly confronted current Google CEO Pichai at one of their weekly meetings. The demand? To reverse its current course of action. Now, despite an apology, a group comprising of more than 200 engineers organized a company-wide walkout for the 1st of November to protest what seems to be Google's protection over perpetrators of sexual harassment. On the 2nd of November, the plan was set into action, and organizers say that at least 20,000 employees and contractors participated in offices in 50 cities around the world. This takes us to September 2020, where Google announced their $310 million sexual harassment settlement, which includes more than 80 updates or changes to its handling of sexual harassment misconduct cases. This was not well received by all, with one Google employee actually taking to court to block the settlement, terming it a whitewash.
Now, let us go into the development of this issue. What Google was facing were preventable risks that eventually led to a crisis. From subsequent media coverage, it became known that the issues surrounding the crisis started with structural gaps that executives with power were allegedly able to exploit. Furthermore, executives abused their power by bypassing existing company policies. The process for reporting harassment and harassment investigations were poorly designed, as arbitration was compulsory and forced. Furthermore, no protection against retaliation was provided for employees. This leads us to the first stage of issue development, where there is a felt need. Using Molitor's framework, we have identified two leading forces. Firstly, a leading event would definitely have to be the departure of Andy Rubin, as mentioned by Tanler. Secondly, the Me Too movement sparked this need as a leading organization. It involved a worldwide social movement where people came forward to publicize allegations of sex crimes. Going into the second stage, media coverage, the New York Times publishes an investigation saying Google paid Rubin a handsome $90 million exit package despite finding credible allegations of sexual harassment. An onslaught of articles followed from CNBC, The Guardian, and Business Insider, just to name a few. Likewise, the Me Too trend made waves in Silicon Valley and in its media coverage. It led to widespread awareness and discussion about sexual harassment and abuse. Moving on to the third stage of issue development, to date, no political jurisdictions have been made. Lastly, the regulations and litigations would refer to the allegations and claims made against the executives for sexual assault. Clearly, the issue has not come to a resolution. In fact, it has built up into a full-blown crisis. As you can see here, all that speculation of the Andy Rubin case and the popularity of the Me Too movement would stand in as the early warning signals in the prodromal stage of a crisis. But what really hammered the nail in the coffin was the release of the New York Times article, where an investigation was launched and it was discovered that Rubin was paid handsomely when he left, despite credible allegations of sexual assault. This was the point of no return. From there, everything went downhill as Google entered the chronic crisis stage. All eyes were on Google. Parent company Alphabet shares were plummeting. The Google walkouts was planned and executed as its employees turned on the company. Google was losing its edge as an employer of choice, which was a key component of its corporate reputation. Although it has been at least 2 years since the Andy Rubin case and Google walkouts, this is still an ongoing crisis for Google. Just recently, even after a $310 million sexual harassment settlement, employees were still not happy as they continue to file lawsuits against Google.
Now we'll be looking at the stakeholders whom Google will have to address. Firstly, Google shareholders who invest in the company would have a direct stake, making them primary social and definitive. Shareholders have a large influence on how the company is run and are the ones mainly affected if the company loses profits. Consumers of Google, as well as companies which collaborate with Google, are the company's primary audience. As they have a direct stake in the organization, this makes them primary social and dormant. The management is a primary stakeholder because they run the company and their livelihood depends on it. For the employees, we have decided to classify them into 4 main groups: victims, drivers, non-active, and supporters. Victims will be primary social definitive because they are directly involved in the issue, and how they react to the company's response and what they complain about would impact the company's reputation. The drivers would be primary social and dependent because it concerns their livelihood and working environment. They are the ones pushing for reformation of policies and practices. The non-active employees are primary social and discretionary because they are still employees but unconcerned. Lastly, the supporters are also primary social and dependent, similar to the drivers because they help the drivers achieve their goals. Next, we'll be going through our secondary stakeholders. The government is not directly involved in Google's case, but laws or policies implemented can affect the running of their business. The media, while not directly involved, their publications can influence opinions on the company and affect their reputation. By communicating what is happening at Google to the public, they are the key source of information which will put Google in a positive or negative light. This is why they are dangerous stakeholders. The competitors are dormant as they are not the ones in the spotlight, so they may decide their course of action following this event to improve their sexual harassment policies or get Google's consumers onto their side. Next, we'll be looking at the possible strategies. Media, drivers, and government need to be collaborated with because they are a mixed blessing. By working together with these stakeholder groups, Google can listen to employee and driver needs to implement new structural changes in the workplace culture with improved transparency. Victims would be non-supportive because they were harmed in the process. Therefore, Google should defend them. Google should implement and enforce strategies that will help victims recover from their traumatic experience, such as preventing the harasser and the victim from working together, not punishing victims for filing reports, and taking cases more seriously. The strategies to deal with managers and stakeholders with substantial rights should be supportive because they need to be involved in new policies and changes required to address the crisis. For marginal stakeholders such as employees who don't care, it would be best to monitor them. They may be influenced by drivers or supporters to protest. Competitors should also be monitored to see their next course of action.
So, what were some common mistakes that Google made in their crisis response? Firstly, failure to act. Google adopted the "if we ignore it, it will go away" policy and ultimately allowed it to escalate. Secondly, bending the facts. Because of incessant litigation, Google shaped communications to the company's economic benefit. Thirdly, lack of empathy. Google's concern for profitability and return on investment precluded expressions of concerns, disregarding the victims. Lastly, restriction on information internally. Google neglected employees, their frontline communicators. Let's talk about the first crisis incident, Andy Rubin. So Rubin received a 90 million severance package upon leaving. Shortly post-publication, Sundar Pichai, Google's chief executive, and Ms. Norton emailed employees that the company had fired 48 people for sexual harassment, but they had no exit package. Reviewing their communication response, Google did a bad job overall. They recruited a credible spokesperson, but the spokesperson did not directly address the issue. They did not reply truthfully either. The actual reason was that Google wanted to avoid a lawsuit for wrongful termination if they did not give Rubin an exit package. They did not respect the opposition's concerns as Google valued its stock price and economic value over the well-being of the victims and their employees. They did reply with visible top management as Sundar Pichai, Google's chief executive, addressed employees. Nonetheless, coupled with the point on recruiting a credible spokesperson and replying truthfully, replying with visible top management does not serve to manage the crisis. They also did not repeat the prior statement regularly at the start. Moving on to the second crisis incident, 2 women organized a global walkout at Google, and the walkout made headlines all over the world. However, the women were demoted and reassigned respectively. Stapleton stated that only after she hired a lawyer did they walk back on her demotion. Still, the environment remains hostile and she considers quitting every day. Reviewing their communication response through Monsanto's 10 Rs, Google did a bad job overall. In this incident, there was no spokesperson that addressed the walkouts directly. They did not respect the opposition's concerns. Google invalidated the concerns of the women. Google did not retreat early, fighting back against a case that was clearly ethically wrong. They did not redouble efforts early if it's a critical company issue, as they continued pressing what is not good for public policy, choosing to punish employees and whistleblowers. Lastly, Alphabet Inc. pledged $310 million to expand diversity efforts and resolve shareholder litigation that alleged that Google hid misconduct by executives. Elaine Norton, Google's human resource chief, made a public statement as well. Google overall did respond adequately this time. Let's first talk about what they did not do well. They did not respond early as they allowed the crisis to escalate with extensive media coverage before the internal audit. They did not reply truthfully as they state that they've worked hard and uphold higher standards instead of admitting guilt and wrongdoings. However, Google did well in respecting the opposition's concerns as they finally formally addressed the issue at hand and put effort into investigating the reports. They also replied with visible top management as Alphabet is the parent company of Google and repeated the statement prior regularly regarding how they take this issue seriously. So what could Google have done? Firstly, Google could have acknowledged fault and spoke truthfully, talk about how those who committed wrong will be dealt with, and most fundamentally, remove the golden parachute for Rubin. Secondly, Google should have admitted their mistakes, then effectively communicate the situation and what Google is doing about it. Thirdly, Google should have responded immediately by admitting fault and include workers' protection measures.
Lastly, we have a few recommendations that we think Google could adopt to better manage the crisis. Some of these recommendations have more surface-level effects that will be beneficial for Google in the short term. Other recommendations that target the root cause would require a longer time before its effects can be seen. However, they are fundamentally more crucial and more effective in the long run. First, considering the practical aspects of the crisis, our group recommends for Google to adopt some logistical changes that can better assure the safety and well-being of workers. This can be achieved by installing security cameras in all office spaces, constructing glass-paned meeting rooms, as well as inculcating the culture of holding meetings in larger groups as far as possible. By having more security cameras and more eyewitnesses to the happenings of the workplace, Google can better assure employees of their safety at work as perpetrators are deterred from acting up. There are, however, some disadvantages. First, setting up the camera and glass-paned meeting rooms may be a hassle and disrupt the workflow of the company. It may also not be feasible for meetings to take place in larger groups. Lastly, these changes will lead to an overall reduction in privacy for workers. These disadvantages and inconveniences are, however, a small price to pay considering the larger issue of sexual harassment within the company. Next, our group proposes for Google to have greater transparency in terms of its career progression and promotion. This recommendation targets the fact that Google was found to be punishing workers who whistleblew by demoting them and reassigning their work to others. By taking the active step and intentional effort to be more transparent about their promotion criteria and reasoning, workers will be assured that their job progression will not be affected by the ethical and right acts of justice. These two recommendations will be targeted at achieving a long-term sustainable effect surrounding this issue. Rather than simply changing surface-level circumstances and deterring perpetrators, these recommendations aim to change the mindset of the individuals with regard to the issue of sexual harassment. First, with workplace training, employees will go through training and education about how they can and should stand up for themselves and others in the event that they see or experience sexual harassment. With greater understanding and empathy for victims of sexual harassment, individuals will better understand why their acts are wrong and also why it is important to stand up for others and self. In terms of its public image, holding these trainings will help Google as it shows that they acknowledge the severity of these issues and are taking concrete steps to mitigate future occurrences. However, these changes in mindsets do not take place overnight, and it may be a long time before the effects of the training is felt. In addition, holding these trainings may be costly, especially if professional speakers and trainers were to be used. Lastly, our group recommends for Google to introduce and provide counseling services within the company, specifically to support employees through this traumatic episode. Given that the offense took place within the workplace, Google has the responsibility to manage the after effects of the situation. The counseling service provides an avenue for employees to turn to or depend on if in need. However, the effectiveness of this service would depend on the employees' trust in the company to not use the information shared during the counseling services against them. Overall, the effectiveness of this recommendation is restricted by the employees' level of trust towards the company. Additionally, it will be costly for Google to engage professional counselors. That's all for recommendation. Back to you, Tenler.
Now that wraps up this week's hot topic. Thank you for tuning in and we'll see you next time.